Dog refuses to leave stranger's grave. When police open it, they freeze in shock. For 3 weeks, the old dog hadn't moved. He was a statue carved from loyalty, a sentinel of rust-colored fur, guarding a makeshift grave on the lonely edge of Havenwood National Forest. The mound of stones was unremarkable, piled with the kind of haste that speaks of either desperation or profound grief. But the dog, a German shepherd mix with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 sorrows, treated it as the most sacred ground on earth. He lay with his head on his paws, his body a crescent of defiance against the biting autumn wind. He ate only what a few kind hikers left, and drank from the morning dew on the fallen leaves. He was waiting. But for who or what? No one in the small town of Havenwood could say. The man the dog belonged to, a quiet recluse named Silas, was gone. And as the first whispers of a brutal winter began to snake down from the mountain peaks, the town sheriff finally decided that enough was enough. The grave had to be opened. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. If emotional stories speak to you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss this one. Let's dive into it. Sheriff Jake Barlow felt the cold deep in his bones, and it had nothing to do with the weather. It was a permanent chill that had set in 6 months ago, the day he buried his wife, Sarah. Now, his life was a series of motions, a hollow echo of the man he used to be. The badge on his chest felt heavier each morning, his reflection in the mirror a stranger's. Havenwood, a town nestled in a valley of breathtaking beauty and crushing isolation, had once been his sanctuary. Now, its towering pines and silent peaks felt like the walls of a prison, each one a reminder of the future Sarah would never see. The call about the dog had been a low priority at first. A stray, a grieving pet. Sad, but not a police matter. But the calls kept coming. The dog, whom the locals had started calling Leo, was becoming a legend. His vigil was too stoic, too purposeful. "He just looks at you, Jake," old Martha from the diner had said, her voice trembling over the phone. Not with anger, with a kind of pleading, like he's protecting the most important secret in the world. That was the phrase that did it. Protecting a secret. Jake drove his cruiser up the winding dirt track, the tires crunching over fallen leaves that bled crimson and gold onto the forest floor. He found the clearing easily. It was just as they'd described. The mound of rocks sat beneath a colossal, ancient oak whose branches clawed at the bruised purple sky. And there was the dog. Leo lifted his head as Jake approached. His fur was matted, his body lean, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. There was no growl, no bared teeth. He simply watched, a low, guttural whine vibrating in his chest. It wasn't a threat, it was a lament. "Hey there, boy," Jake said softly, keeping his distance. He held out a piece of jerky he'd bought at the station. "You've been out here a long time." The dog's gaze flickered to the jerky. His nose twitched, but he didn't move from his spot. He pressed his body tighter against the cold stones, as if to physically shield them. Jake saw it then, the profound, unbreakable bond between the animal and the earth. It was a grief he recognized. It was the same way he felt standing at Sarah's grave, a desperate need to stay close, to guard the last piece of them left in the world. A painful kinship tightened in his chest. "I get it," Jake whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "I really do." His investigation into Silas began as a formality. He was a ghost long before he vanished. He'd lived in a small, dilapidated cabin 4 miles deeper into the forest, bought his supplies in cash, and spoke to almost no one. The only living soul he seemed to interact with was the stray he'd taken in. Leo. Jake visited the cabin. The door was unlocked, creaking on rusted hinges. Inside, it was sparse but tidy. Books on botany and geology were stacked on a simple wooden table. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside them, a skin of mold growing on its surface. But it was the floor that caught Jake's eye, a fresh, dark stain near the doorway, and the faint, almost imperceptible scuff marks of 2 sets of boots dragging something heavy out the door. This wasn't a man who had simply wandered off and died of exposure. This was foul play. His unease solidified when he ran into 2 men on the trail back. They were locals, Marcus Thorne and his younger, twitchier cousin, Clint. They ran a logging operation on the edge of the park, one that was perpetually skirting the boundaries of legality. "Heard you were poking around about old man Silas," Marcus said, his voice smooth, but his eyes as hard as river stones. He leaned against a tree, all false nonchalance. Tragic thing, he was always a bit odd. Probably just went for a walk and got turned around. "Maybe," Jake said, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his service weapon. "You 2 see him recently?" Clint shifted his weight, avoiding Jake's gaze. "Nah, Sheriff. Haven't seen him in weeks. We stick to our own business." They were lying. Jake could feel it, a cold certainty that prickled the back of his neck. They knew something. As he drove away, he saw them in his rearview mirror, their heads together, their expressions no longer casual but hard-edged and venomous. The first snowflake of the season landed on his windshield as he pulled back into town. It melted into a tear, sliding down the glass. The forecast called for a blizzard, a monster storm that would dump feet of snow on the mountains, burying everything until spring. It was a deadline. Whatever secret that grave held, whatever story Leo was trying to tell, would be lost under a blanket of white. He made the call. He told his deputy, a young, eager officer named Ben, to get a crew with shovels and meet him at the clearing at dawn. "Are we sure about this, Sheriff?" Ben had asked, his voice hesitant. "Desecrating a grave? It feels wrong." "What feels wrong?" Jake replied, his voice grim as he stared out at the swirling flurries, "is letting a lie stay buried." He felt a flicker of the old fire, the sense of purpose that had been dormant for so long. For the first time in months, he wasn't just reacting to his grief. He was acting in spite of it. He was a lawman again. The dawn broke gray and reluctant, the air tasting of iron and impending snow. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the clearing, curious townspeople and a local news reporter, drawn by the grim spectacle. Jake's jaw was tight as he scanned their faces, his eyes lingering for a moment on Marcus and Clint, who stood at the back, their arms crossed, watching with predatory stillness. Leo was frantic. As Ben and another deputy approached the mound with shovels, the dog sprang to his feet, barking with a desperate, heartbreaking intensity. He ran in frantic circles around the stones, his body a blur of motion, positioning himself between the men and the grave. He wasn't aggressive, but his panic was palpable. "Get him out of here, Ben," Jake ordered, his voice heavy with regret. Ben tried to loop a catchpole around Leo's neck, but the dog was too agile, too smart. He dodged and weaved, his cries echoing through the silent forest. Jake couldn't stand it. He walked forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy, boy. Easy," he murmured, kneeling down. He looked directly into the dog's tormented eyes. "I know you're scared, but I have to know what you're protecting. I have to know the truth." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The dog stopped barking, He looked at Jake, a long, searching gaze. A low whine escaped his throat. And then, as if understanding the sheriff's intent, he took a few steps back and lay down, his head on his paws, his body trembling. He would watch, he would bear witness. The work began. The stones were cold and heavy, slick with moss. The deputies worked with a grim reverence, placing each one carefully to the side. The metallic scrape of shovel against rock was the only sound, a funereal rhythm under the darkening sky. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, carrying the scent of snow and damp earth. "Sheriff, we hit something," Ben called out. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He moved forward, peering into the shallow pit. It wasn't a coffin. It was a series of thick, rough-hewn wooden planks covered by a waterproof tarp. It was a roof. Carefully, they pried the first plank loose. A wave of stale, musty air washed over them, thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and antiseptic. Jake shone his flashlight into the darkness below, and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't Silas. Lying on a bed of pine boughs and old blankets was a man, pale and gaunt, his face covered in a sweat-sheened grimace of pain. His leg was crudely splintered, the skin around it a sickening purple. He was alive, but only just. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. That was the first shock. The second shock was his clothes. He was wearing the tattered remains of a park ranger's uniform. The third, and most profound shock, was what was attached to his wrist. A thick steel chain, the other end bolted to a heavy, silver briefcase. The crowd gasped. The news reporter fumbled with his camera. Jake felt a surge of adrenaline that was cold as ice. This wasn't a missing person case anymore. This was a federal crime. He looked from the injured ranger to the briefcase, and then his eyes shot to the back of the crowd. Marcus and Clint were gone. "Seal the area," Jake yelled, his voice cracking through the stunned silence. "Nobody in or out. Ben, get on the radio, call for an ambulance, and get me the state police and the FBI. Tell them we have an injured federal agent and a potential hostage situation. Go, now." As medics rushed forward with a stretcher, Jake knelt beside the barely conscious man. He gently touched his shoulder. "Son, can you hear me? My name is Sheriff Barlow. You're safe now." The ranger's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but a flicker of recognition, of relief, passed through them. His dry, cracked lips moved, forming a single, hoarse word. "Silas?" "What about Silas?" Jake pressed gently. He saved me," the ranger whispered, his voice catching. "They ambushed me. The loggers. They were dumping chemicals. I got evidence." He gestured weakly with his chained hand towards the briefcase. "Silas. He knew they'd kill me. He had this place, his winter shelter. He put me in here, told me to wait." The story spilled out in broken fragments. The ranger, Agent Evans, had been conducting a covert investigation into Marcus Thorne's illegal operations. He'd found proof of poaching and toxic waste dumping, but they'd caught him. They shot him in the leg and were about to finish him off when Silas, who had been foraging nearby, intervened. The quiet, gentle hermit created a diversion, a brave, foolish act of defiance. Before he led them away, on a false trail, he made one last promise to the wounded agent. "My dog," Silas had told him, his voice urgent. "Leo, he'll stay. He'll guard you. Don't you worry. He's the most loyal friend you could ever ask for." Then Silas had run, drawing the armed men after him, sacrificing himself, and he had ordered his dog, his only companion, to stay and protect the stranger in the ground. The truth hit Jake with the force of a physical blow. Leo's vigil wasn't born of grief, for a dead master. It was a duty, a sacred promise kept for weeks in the biting cold, fueled by nothing but love and a command. The dog hadn't been guarding a grave. He'd been guarding a life. Just then, a roar of an engine shattered the fragile peace. It was Thorne's heavy-duty logging truck, barreling back down the dirt road, kicking up mud and stones. They weren't running. They were coming back. They were coming back for the briefcase. The blizzard, no longer a threat, but a reality, chose that moment to unleash its fury. Snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets, turning the world into a swirling vortex of white. "Get him in my cruiser," Jake screamed over the wind. "We need to get off this mountain." The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The blizzard hit not as a gentle curtain of snow, but as a physical assault, a wall of wind and ice that stole the breath and blinded the eye. Jake's cruiser fish-tailed on the muddy track, the tires struggling for purchase. In the back seat, Ben was trying to keep Agent Evans stable, his face a mask of concentration. Leo was in the front passenger seat, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror where the menacing grille of the logging truck loomed, its headlights cutting yellow spears through the chaos. "They're boxing us in," Ben shouted, his voice tight with panic. The truck slammed into their rear bumper. The cruiser lurched forward, the impact sending a jarring shockwave through the vehicle. Jake fought the wheel, his knuckles white. They were on a narrow shelf road, a sheer drop to their right, a wall of rock to their left. Marcus was trying to push them over the edge. "He's not trying to stop us. He's trying to kill us all," Jake muttered, his mind racing, calculating angles, options, heartbeats. The calm that settled over him was terrifying in its clarity. The grief, the apathy that had clouded his life for months, burned away in the fire of the moment, leaving behind the pure, sharp instinct of a protector. He was no longer mourning Sarah. He was fighting to keep her memory from being the last thing he ever thought about. He saw his chance, a narrow fork in the road ahead. The main track curved left, but an old, rickety-looking wooden bridge forded the gorge to the right. It was a shortcut, but a dangerous one. On the other side, the road was paved. It was their only hope. "Hold on," he yelled. He wrenched the wheel hard to the right. The cruiser skidded, tires screaming, and shot onto the wooden planks of the bridge. The structure groaned under the sudden weight. Behind them, the logging truck, too large and heavy to make the sharp turn, screeched past the fork, its horn blaring in frustration. They had a lead, but it wouldn't last. Marcus would turn around. Halfway across the bridge, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The impact had ruptured something. They were stranded. "The bridge won't hold their truck," Jake said, his mind working furiously. "But it won't hold us for long in this storm either. We have to move, on foot." The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at them as they exited the vehicle. Jake and Ben, half carried, half dragged the delirious Agent Evans, the briefcase banging against Jake's leg. The cold was brutal, instantly numbing. Every breath was a shard of ice in their lungs. Leo stayed close, a furry shield against the gale, his body pressed against Jake's leg. They had almost reached the other side when two figures emerged from the swirling snow at the far end of the bridge. Marcus and Clint. They had circled back on foot. Marcus was holding a high-powered hunting rifle, its scope a single, malevolent eye. "That's far enough, Sheriff." Marcus's voice was surprisingly clear in the wind. "Just leave the case and the ranger. You and your deputy can walk away. I have no quarrel with you." "The hell you don't, Marcus," Jake shouted back, positioning himself in front of Evans. "This is over." "It's over when I say it is." Marcus raised the rifle, A shot rang out, the crack echoing strangely in the snow-muffled air. It wasn't aimed at them. It splintered the wooden railing just inches from Jake's head. A warning. "The next one won't miss," Marcus yelled. "The case." Jake's mind was a whirlwind. His service pistol was no match for a hunting rifle at this distance, especially in this wind. They were completely exposed. He looked at Ben's terrified face, at Evans, who was shivering uncontrollably, at Leo, whose body was coiled like a spring, a low, menacing growl now emanating from his throat. He was trapped. A moral and tactical dead end. Give up the evidence and let killers walk free, or watch his men and himself die on this godforsaken bridge. His life had been defined by duty, by a clear line between right and wrong. But the blizzard had blurred everything into a terrifying grey. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he'd made to uphold the law, to be a good man. What would she want him to do? And in that moment of crippling indecision, he looked at Leo. The dog wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking at Clint, the weaker link, who was shifting nervously, his eyes darting between the armed standoff and the raging gorge below. Leo's intelligence was terrifying. He was assessing, planning. He was waiting for his moment. Jake understood. Sometimes, loyalty isn't about following orders. It's about seeing a path no one else can and having the courage to take it. He locked eyes with the dog, and in that fleeting, silent exchange, a desperate, insane plan was forged. He gave a barely perceptible nod. It was all the signal Leo needed. The world slowed to a crawl. The roar of the wind became a distant hum. Every snowflake seemed to hang suspended in the air. Jake saw Marcus adjust his grip on the rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was taking aim. This was the end of the warnings. Jake braced himself, a silent apology to Sarah on his lips. But before Marcus could fire, a blur of fur and fury exploded from Jake's side. Leo launched himself across the snow-dusted planks, a low, powerful missile of righteous anger. He didn't go for Marcus, the obvious threat. He went for Clint. With a guttural snarl that was torn away by the wind, he slammed into the younger man's chest, sending him staggering backward with a cry of shock and pain. The diversion was perfect. For a single, critical second, Marcus's attention snapped to his cousin. His aim wavered. It was the only opening Jake would get. "Now," he roared. He pushed Evans and Ben toward the end of the bridge. "Get him to cover." Then he charged. He didn't run like a cop. He ran like a man with nothing left to lose, his feet pounding on the groaning wood. He closed the distance in a few desperate strides, a wild shout tearing from his throat. Marcus swung the rifle back toward him, his eyes wide with surprise. But it was too late. Jake crashed into him, driving his shoulder into the man's sternum. The rifle discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet whining harmlessly into the grey sky. The two men, locked in a desperate embrace, stumbled against the railing. The old wood splintered and cracked under their combined weight. They fell, not into the gorge, but onto a narrow, snow-covered ledge a few feet below the bridge, a remnant of an older, lower crossing. The impact knocked the wind out of Jake. The rifle skittered away, lost in the snow. The briefcase, its chain still attached to the now unconscious Evans, who lay on the bridge above, slipped from Jake's grasp and dangled over the abyss, its silver surface a stark beacon in the storm. Below them, the river churned, a torrent of icy grey water. Marcus recovered first. He was bigger, stronger. His face was a mask of pure hate. He slammed a fist into Jake's jaw, his head snapping back against the rock face. Stars exploded behind Jake's eyes. "You should have just walked away, Sheriff," Marcus snarled, his hands closing around Jake's throat. Jake's vision began to tunnel. The cold, the lack of air, the throbbing pain. He clawed at Marcus's hands, but his own were numb, useless. He was losing. Above them on the bridge, the scene was chaos. Ben was trying to pull Evans to safety without sending the precious briefcase tumbling into the gorge. Clint was scrambling away from Leo, who stood his ground, a fierce guardian in the storm, his barks echoing in the canyon. And Leo saw what was happening below. He saw his new master, the man who had understood his vigil, being killed. With another ferocious bark, he did the last thing anyone would expect. He turned from the cowering Clint and leaped from the bridge. He landed on the ledge with a soft thud, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the icy rock. Without hesitation, he lunged at Marcus's back, sinking his teeth into the thick fabric of the man's coat and pulling with all his might. The sudden attack, the unexpected weight, was enough. Marcus's grip on Jake's throat loosened. He roared in anger, twisting to throw the dog off him. That was the moment. Jake sucked in a desperate, life-giving breath of icy air. All the grief, all the loss, all the rage of the last 6 months coalesced into one final surge of strength. He drove his knee up into Marcus's gut, and as the bigger man doubled over, Jake shoved with every ounce of force he had left. Marcus Thorne teetered on the edge of the precipice for a heartbeat, his arms flailing, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then, with a scream that was swallowed by the storm, he fell backward into the churning, icy void. Silence. Jake lay on the ledge, his chest heaving, his body screaming in protest. The snow fell softly on his face, cold and purifying. He looked at Leo, who was whining softly, licking his hand. The dog had saved him. The loyal, stubborn, magnificent dog. "Good boy," Jake breathed, his voice a raw whisper. "Good boy." Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself up. Ben was peering over the edge, his face pale with shock and relief. "Sheriff, are you okay?" "I'm okay, Ben," Jake said, his voice stronger now. He reached up and grabbed Ben's outstretched hand, allowing himself to be pulled back onto the relative safety of the bridge. He looked at the briefcase, now safe. He looked at Agent Evans, who was stirring, protected. He looked at Clint, who was sobbing in a heap, his fight long gone. And he looked at Leo, who sat beside him, panting, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. The fire within him was no longer just a flicker. It was a steady, burning flame. The storm was still raging, but inside Sheriff Jake Barlow, the blizzard had finally broken. The aftermath was a blur of officialdom and quiet reflection. State police and federal agents descended on Havenwood, their crisp uniforms and serious faces a stark contrast to the town's rugged charm. The story came out in its entirety. Marcus Thorne's body was recovered miles downstream. Clint, singing like a canary, confessed to everything, leading them to the shallow grave where they had buried the quiet, brave hermit, Silas. Silas was given a hero's funeral. The whole town turned out, along with a delegation of stern-faced park rangers and a grateful Agent Evans, his leg in a cast, but his spirit unbroken. He spoke of Silas's selfless courage, of a man who barely knew him but gave his life for him without a second thought. The briefcase he'd been protecting contained irrefutable evidence that dismantled a multi-state poaching and chemical dumping ring, saving a vast swathe of the national forest from irreversible damage. But for Jake, the true hero of the story was sitting quietly at his feet. In the days that followed, Leo rarely left Jake's side. The sheriff's house, once a silent monument to grief, was now filled with the soft patting of paws on hardwood floors and the gentle thud of a tail against a chair leg. The oppressive quiet had been replaced by a comforting presence. Agent Evans, before he was transferred, made a special visit. He knelt down in front of Leo, his eyes filled with a raw, profound gratitude. "Your master was the bravest man I ever met," he told the dog, stroking his head. "And he taught you well. You never gave up. You saved my life." He looked at Jake. "He belongs with you, Sheriff. You both saved each other, I think." Jake knew it was true. The case had reignited his purpose, but it was Leo who had healed his heart. In the dog's unwavering loyalty, Jake found a reflection of the love he had lost and a reason to build a new life. He looked at this incredible animal, who had held a vigil for a promise, who had guarded a stranger with his life, who had stared down killers on a bridge in a blizzard, and felt a sense of awe. One crisp spring morning, months later, Jake stood in the Havenwood Cemetery. The snow was gone, replaced by the first courageous buds of wildflowers. The air was clean and full of promise. He stood before two graves, side by side. One belonged to his beloved Sarah. The other was a simple, elegant headstone for Silas, paid for by the U.S. Park Service. It read, "Silas, a quiet man, a silent guardian, a hero." Leo sat beside him, his head resting on Jake's knee. He looked from one grave to the other, then up at Jake, a soft whine in his throat. He understood. They were two souls, a man and a dog, who had navigated the depths of loss and found their way back to the light, bound together by the memory of those they had loved and the promise of the days ahead. Jake rested his hand on Leo's head, the warmth of his fur a comfort against his palm. The mountains stood silent, watching over them, no longer a prison, but a sanctuary once more. He had found his way home. The story of Jake and Leo is more than a tale of survival. It's a powerful reminder that the deepest loyalties are not bound by blood, but forged in moments of kindness. Silas showed a stray dog compassion, and that single act of grace echoed through time, saving a life and redeeming a soul. It reminds us that courage isn't always a loud roar. Sometimes it's a quiet, patient vigil in the cold. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to reflect on the quiet heroes in your own life, the people and the animals who show up when it matters most. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of the incredible power of loyalty and sacrifice. And in the comments below, let's fill the space with stories of kindness, big or small. Because as Silas and Leo proved, you never know how far one good deed will travel. Thank you for watching.